Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Amazing Alien Encounters, 10 True Cases. I just love the cases involving humanoids. I find them endlessly fascinating, and every single one of the cases that I will be presenting today involve humanoids. Actually, humanoids of all different kinds. Short little beings, grays, human-looking ETs, robotic ETs, and more. So, these cases do come from all over the world. I love finding cases that cover our entire planet. So I have cases from Russia, from Sweden, England, Spain, one from Canada, a couple from South America, Argentina and Brazil, and of course a couple of US cases as well, one from New Zealand. So quite a wide geographical area. And of course, stretching all the way back to the 1940s up through the 1980s. Each of these cases does have evidence of some form or another, whether it's simply eyewitness testimony, but a good number of them have the whole range of evidence that we often see, which of course is landing traces, electromagnetic effects, physiological or medical effects, animal reactions, some really interesting cases involving psychic effects as well. As I've said many times, each case provides another piece of the puzzle answering some of the many questions surrounding ET contact and the ET agenda on our planet. So each case does have something to offer to sort of further our understanding of what's going on here. So yeah, 10 cases, and each is unique in its own way. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I love because it's a very early case involving a quite unusual humanoid, a really unusual UFO, and also some very interesting psychic effects. And I call this one a piece that passes all understanding. This one took place in New Zealand, actually, in Christchurch, New Zealand, way back in August of 1944. The primary witness in this case is a sister and a nurse by the name of E.M. Church, and she worked at the time of her encounter at the very well-known Cashmere Sanatorium. And it was one afternoon in August of 1944 that she had the day off and decided that she would take a walk among the gentle hills behind the sanatorium, as you can see here. Now, when she saw some low clouds moving in, she feared that she might get lost, so she decided to cut her hike short and turn around. And as she's walking back to the Cashmere Sanatorium, this is when she came upon a, quote, upturned saucer, which she said sat on a small hill, quote, very close to the road. She said it was hidden from sight from the road by a small rise, but she saw it, and thinking it was some sort of advanced aircraft, now mind you, this was during World War II, she walked right up to it. She actually thought it might be a gimmick from the Industries Fair, which was being held at that time at nearby Christchurch, and she thought to herself, what will they invent next? So she said she walked up to this thing and stood quite close to it. She felt no effect from it, but as she's watching it, she said she was absolutely astonished to see 3 4-foot tall figures who she called, quote, little fellas. They were standing inside these transparent, rectangular, glass-like cases. Again, 3 of them. One was looking out a window of the craft. One was standing in a doorway of the craft. And the third was standing outside right next to the craft. So at this point, she's still thinking this might be something mundane, conventional, and she's wondering, could they be Japanese? 2 of them wore helmets, but the one outside did not. And she said that they had quite big heads, composing nearly half their body height. They appeared to be greenish in color, and she couldn't see any visible arms or legs. And as Miss Church says in her own words, the occupants of the object appeared to be absorbed in watching the fair and city generally. The one outside was just a green-colored entity in a transparent box-like casing, just standing there. So she did provide drawings, as you can see, of these figures. But the craft itself was also very strange. She said it was about 20 feet across, 9 feet tall, with, quote, kind of a plain, ordinary aluminum turret on top. And above that, she said, there was a 3-foot high, mast-like cylindrical projection, much in the shape of a pipe, but it had a mushroom-shaped cap on top. And she could see a pale blue light shining from the very top of this mast-like projection. The base of the object itself was flat. She said it was brown in color and looked quite strange, as though it was composed of tiles, almost like a wood veneer, she said. And again, the center of the object did have a door, and to the right was a window, and this is where she was seeing these 3 figures. So she's looking at this, trying to figure it out, but the clouds were moving in fast. So Miss Church decided she was going to take a closer look. She said she actually wanted to, quote, talk to the people, even get a ride. I wasn't afraid. I didn't have any sense of fear at all. So she just walks right up to it, and she says approached to about 18 feet of the occupant and 25 feet from the ship. So very, very close. And she was actually walking closer when her footsteps made a noise. She stepped on a stick or some leaves or something, and this caused the occupant to notice her, and the one who was outside looked directly at her. At that instant, his helmet flipped over his head automatically, and he, quote, drifted, still inside his enclosure, back into the craft. And it was weird because he wasn't walking. She said he moved in, quote, a kind of sliding movement into the space thing. He slid straight into the very small opening. So she only got a brief look at these UFO occupants, and as she watched, the door slid closed like a sliding door. She felt as though she had interrupted them, and that if she hadn't come upon them, they would have stayed longer. But unfortunately, she did interrupt them, and the object then made a whirring noise. The blue light on the craft brightened, and the craft itself rose vertically. It took a couple of minutes to rise upwards into the clouds, and then it was gone. And she had a very interesting reaction once it left. As she says, when the thing took off, I wish I could have gone with it. I felt a sense of loss as it disappeared. And it gets even more interesting. While she felt no immediate after effects from the encounter other than the wonder of having encountered this, as she lay down to sleep that evening, she did feel something very strange. She said it was, quote, just as though a presence came into the room. You know, in the Bible, it tells you of a peace that passes all understanding. That was the kind of peace that seemed to come, as though there was a presence in the room, but you couldn't see it. It was unusual. It seemed to stay with me for the whole week. And what's amazing about this is while this affected her profoundly, it started to affect the people around her as well. As Miss Church says in her own words, all the patients I went to responded to me. It was just as though I had an external spirit guiding me. I don't know why. A woman said to me, I get a wonder feeling when I stand beside you. I was aware that there was something about me. I don't know what it was. So this is an amazing after effect. It somehow caused a sort of spiritual awakening in her, which is something we do often see. At any rate, Miss Church became thoroughly convinced that she did see something very unusual beyond a conventional craft. As she says in her own words, I don't care if anybody believes me or not. I did see this thing. I think they're craft from some outer space. And some corroboration of her experience. It was 7 years later when a Reverend H. Brown in the area reported seeing what was apparently the same or similarly described craft, though when he was asked about it by investigators, he denied the sighting and refused to talk about it. What an amazing case that is, how it affected the witness spiritually. And she's a good witness, a medical professional, someone with some deep religious convictions, not the type of person who would be prone to lying or making up stories. And again, a very early case. I love how she was very resistant to call this something from outer space until it became very clear that there was no other explanation. And the fact is, she got right up close to this landed craft and humanoids. And that makes this a really interesting case because there's really little chance of misperception. Now, moving along in time, we go all the way to Lago, Argentina. This is a very interesting case, which I call a UFO landing with humanoids. This took place on March 18, 1950, and is one of the earliest reports of humanoids in this area. Some have called it the earliest. I don't know if that's still true or not, but it's quite an amazing encounter with a landed UFO and human-looking ETs, and of course has some amazing evidence as well. This case was originally published in La Razón, which is an Argentine newspaper published in Portuguese, and was apparently never officially investigated. Nevertheless, it is an intriguing report. At 6:30 p.m., a rancher by the name of Wilfredo H. Aravelo was at his ranch in Lago Argentino, this is quite a large lake, when he observed a metallic disc land near his property. And Wilfredo describes this experience in his own words. So I'll just quote him directly. As Alfredo says, "I suddenly saw in the clear sky, coming from the southeast at fantastic speed, two luminous points that, describing wide circles, were approaching the earth. I initially believed that they were falling stars, but suddenly one of those lights took on a dizzying height and remained fixed in space. The other began to describe pronounced circles at lower and lower altitudes until it landed softly on the ground 3 kilometers in front of me, in the pasture field of La Buenqueada, on the road to the lake. Despite the distance, I was able to really realize that it was an extremely white and phosphorescent circular machine from which bluish smoke emerged from the back, extremely luminous and dense. I started my truck, approaching cautiously because I thought that perhaps it was some jet plane from our military aeronautics that had crashed. I stopped my vehicle 150 meters away from that silver machine that shone intensely among the tall grasses, because there, extremely impressed, I realized that this was not an airplane, but an extremely curious thing from which a dense bluish-green vapor which smelled strongly of burning benzene. The circular machine had a large rotating plane that constantly rotated like a Victrola record. Its structure seemed to be made of aluminum or some other very light metal, and it was strangely phosphorescent. In its middle part was located a large glass cabin, or something similar, in the shape of a dome, of dazzling transparency and clarity. Inside moved 4 extremely tall and slender men, dressed in white clothes fitted close to their bodies. Those figures had to be at least 2 meters tall, calculating that the diameter of the cabin was 8 meters and that of the rotating plane 15 meters. The crew of the machine seemed to have their bodies wrapped in something like cellophane covers, as their figures shone in a very strange way. Their faces were extremely pale, almost pure white. Their other proportions were normal and even graceful. They shone wrapped in those kinds of cellophane covers, and I think they managed to discover me because suddenly they illuminated me in a blinding way and watched me like that for a long time. The intense luminosity of the transparent vault in which those tall men moved prevented me from seeing perfectly the white objects that they used. But despite this, I thought I noticed two types of mirrors or camera lenses that rotated and moved continuously, and a number of devices similar to those used by dentists, in which I thought I saw a number of instruments similar to those used on airplane dashboards. Despite the curious nature of the spectacle, I was going to try and get closer to them to verify who they were, or if, having suffered some mishap, they needed any help. At that moment, the flat machine spun quickly on its axis, and placing itself in front of me, it dazzled me with a very strong bluish light that seemed to emerge from its front part. Suddenly the machine began to expel intense blue smoke and a reddish-green flame from its rear part, and it rose as if propelled upwards by a springboard, emitting a soft hum, and in seconds it became a luminous point. So this is all from Alfredo's letter to the La Razón newspaper. And he goes on to describe how this craft joined the second craft, which was still hovering up in the sky, and then both darted off. At this point, Alfredo drove off at high speed and returned home to ponder what he saw. And the next day, he decided to return to the site with two of his farm hands. They traveled on horseback and went into this field where the craft had landed, and they found, quote, broken and charred grasses. So he not only sent this letter to the newspaper, he included drawings of the craft, and he said that he would report his encounter to military officials. But he ended his letter by saying, quote, I am sure of what I have seen. And later it was discovered that other people in the area saw a similarly described craft in the same area at the same time. That, I think you'll agree, is a truly spectacular case. I like it because there are additional witnesses, some very interesting effects in terms of the landing traces found, also the odor described, the human-looking ETs. I think there's a lot to learn from each of these cases. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Each case provides another piece of the puzzle, answers so many of the questions surrounding this UFO phenomenon. And moving along to the next case, which is quite brief but very unusual. I call it, They Walked Off into Space. This one took place on October 8, 1968 in a little town called Asbestos, Canada. Yeah, you heard me right, asbestos. And I think that might provide an important clue as to why the ET visited this particular area. There's not a lot known about this case, but again, it's quite unusual and does have multiple witnesses, and the witnesses provided drawings. Paul, his wife, and two of his in-laws were watching television in their home in Asbestos. The city is now renamed Val des Sources. Suddenly, Paul's wife looked out the window and she saw a strange, illuminated, kind of rectangular-shaped green glow in the sky. And she shouted out, Paul, hurry, look! So Paul and the others jumped up and looked and watched as this green glow brightened. And suddenly, a solid-looking saucer-shaped craft emerged from the glow. This saucer had yellow-orange lights around it, 3 lights beneath it. Paul and his brother-in-law rushed outside to get a better look. They actually got into their car and drove towards the city of St. George in an attempt to get closer. Meanwhile, this UFO started to move off in another direction. It darted behind a cloud, lighting it up with green illumination. The two men followed it again down the road towards the city of St. Cloud. Now, as they approached closer, this dazzling sphere of yellow-orange light emerged from the cloud, and they parked their car and got out and watched it. and it was quite apparent. In fact, residents of a nearby home came out and also watched this. All of them walked closer to the object, which was now close enough to bathe them in its illumination. And it was so close, in fact, that they became frightened and decided to flee the scene. Now, unknown to them, back at the house, Paul's wife and sister-in-law were in the house watching the UFO the whole time, and they said that they saw very distinctly as two humanoid shapes emerged from the craft, as you can see here, and walked seemingly into space. After that, the object then moved towards the city of Windsor, disappearing slowly, and was lost among the stars. It's certainly an interesting sighting, made all the more interesting by its location over a town famous for mining asbestos. So perhaps this was the reason that it was hovering over the town? Hard to say. Yes, that is a brief case, but it does involve multiple witnesses. It went on for quite some time, and it's really interesting. I do think it's entirely possible that the ETs were visiting this area because of the asbestos mine. There are so many cases of ETs investigating mines. I'm, of course, speculating here. We don't know. I feel like there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes that we just aren't privy to. We don't have all the answers, which is why research is so important. And moving along, this is another very interesting case, which I suspect involves ETs that were drawn to a particular area. I call this one the alien in the orchard. This is a single witness case. There isn't a whole lot of physical evidence really at all to support this case, though it was very thoroughly investigated, and it's certainly fascinating. This one occurred in August of 1973 in Nova Friburgo, and this is in Brazil. It was 2 p.m. on a sunny afternoon, again in August of 1973, as 19-year-old Edmund Cardoso de Oliveira took a break from working on the orchard of the farm where he was employed. He sat down and was peeling an orange to eat, and this is when he noticed something strange. About 45 feet away from him, the leaves of a very unusual tree, which is called the jaboticaba tree, the leaves were all shaking, though all the other trees around it were standing still. It was not a windy day, so these leaves should not be quivering the way they were. So peering more closely at this strange sight, this is when he saw, quote, an eye-hurting, shining ball like bluish aluminum. He said it was hovering less than 2 feet above the ground, it was about 6 feet in diameter, oval in shape, and had a dark green band around the center, the perimeter. And he was amazed by how brightly this metallic object was glowing, and he decided to get closer. And he walked right up to it, to about 3 feet away. He could now get a much closer look at this spherical object, and he said in fact it had a metal cylinder attached to the top of it, which went straight up, and on top of this metal cylinder there was an upside down cone-shaped device which was rotating counterclockwise. The whole object seemed to wobble unsteadily, and fearing it might actually fall on him, Edmund turned around and retreated about 12 feet. And as soon as he did so, he heard this loud metallic cracking sound, sort of like a door being slammed, and turning back around, he saw that in fact a metal door had opened from the bottom half of the sphere, this oval-shaped object. This door was quite small, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. He could see it close enough that the wall of the sphere itself was about 2 inches thick. Inside this opening he saw nothing but darkness at first, but after about 30 seconds he was amazed to see a humanoid being, which was taller than the door just a little bit. It had to stoop slightly as it stepped out of the craft. He estimates this being was just over 3 feet tall, was dressed in a black jumpsuit which had a really interesting sort of material to it, with all these little kind of circles all over the material of this jumpsuit. He said the cuffs and the sleeves and the collar were gray, as were the shoes. Now the being's face was covered, but it appeared to have holes and eyes and a mouth. And on its back, it had strapped to it a sort of metallic looking box, much like a backpack. So Edmund's watching all of this, and the humanoid exits the craft in a very unusual way. Not by walking, although it was moving its arms and legs vigorously, but it appeared to be floating along on a sort of flexible, transparent mat, and it made it appear as though this humanoid was actually floating. And to Edmund's amazement, this being quickly approached him to a distance of about 3 feet, standing directly in front of him. So now, seeing this very strange humanoid right in front of him, Edmund became filled with fear, and he turned and he ran away. But as he did so, he did stop and look back. About 3 times, he said, just to make sure that the ET wasn't following him. And it wasn't, but either way, he ran quickly towards the farmhouse to find his boss. He found the boss's wife and another employee, and he returned to the site of the encounter with this other employee. Unfortunately, by this time, the craft and the ET were now gone. Later, the owner of the farm questioned Edmund in detail and could not shake him from his story, found him to be very sincere and trustworthy. And later, there was a full investigation of the incident by UFO researchers. They were not able to find any hard evidence of the encounter, landing traces, or anything like this, but neither did they find any evidence of a hoax. I wish there were other witnesses to that case. I'm sure the witness himself does as well, but it's still a remarkable case, and there are so many cases of ETs visiting farms that I suspect that's probably why the ET was there. Again, pure speculation, but perhaps they were there to pick oranges or the weird fruit from this tree that is so unusual and apparently grows only in Brazil and the surrounding areas. Very hard to say for sure. At any rate, certainly a fascinating case, and so is the next one, which is also quite brief, but really unusual, and it has, I think, some interesting takeaways. I call this one the 3-foot-tall humanoid. Again, a very brief case, took place on October 29, 1973 in Copeland, North Carolina. And it's interesting because this was right smack in the middle of a huge wave of humanoid sightings sweeping across the United States and, for that matter, the world. This case, from researcher George Fawcett, involves a family of 3, David A. Doby, his wife, their son, and, as it turns out, their dog. It was around 7:45 p.m. on October 19, 1973, and the family was just leaving their home to attend a football game when they saw a large, blue, oval-shaped object hovering over their mobile home. Now, they did live on a little farm plot. David's attention was focused solely on this strange craft hovering above their home when suddenly his wife let out a scream. And standing in their front yard, they all saw a 3-foot-tall humanoid dressed from head to toe in a sort of golden metallic suit. In fact, even the face appeared to be covered. So they reacted with extreme fear. They quickly piled into their car and screeched off, leaving their home, and actually would not return that night. They ended up staying at David's father's house, George Doby. They were so scared they even left their dog behind. But the dog also apparently fled because when the family returned the next day, the dog was missing and only returned later. So yes, this is a brief case, but it's important because it's part of this huge wave of humanoids that was occurring in late 1973. It also shows how frightening an encounter can be and is, of course, another amazing example of an animal reaction to the presence of a UFO, and in this case, a humanoid. To me, the most interesting takeaway from that case is how the people, the witnesses, reacted to the presence of this humanoid. It absolutely terrified them. This is so unfortunate because I don't think that the ET was there to hurt them. But even the dog ran away for a full day. It's a good example of an animal reaction case. So that alone, I think, makes this case significant. And there's so many cases. It's just case after case after case. I don't know how people can continue to be skeptical of this phenomenon when there are so many darn cases. Because here's another one. I call this one ETs from a phone booth shaped UFO. And that, I think, is the most unique and bizarre aspect of this case, is the shape of the craft itself. This case took place on October 29, 1976 in Baracaldo, Spain. It is a multiple witness case, and it also has some very other unusual elements to it, as we shall see. This case comes from researcher Juan Jose Benitez, the author of many books, someone who has investigated a lot of cases. It involves 6 boys who were out playing next to a walled-in field near a cemetery when suddenly they heard a very loud crackling sound coming from above. And looking up, they saw the source of this sound. It was a cylindrical object shaped much like a telephone booth descending into the field. So 2 of the boys had enough courage to run over to this field to investigate, and they saw that this object had actually landed in the field. In fact, it stood on 3 landing legs, and they could see that this object was emitting white and red lights. It appeared to be metallic. An oval-shaped opening appeared, emitting this red light from the interior. And then out stepped, they said, 2 very tall, human-like figures that were wearing tight-fitting black diving suits with a wide, bright belt. Now the boys said that they did see 2 bright, shiny eyes on each of these beings, but no other facial features could be discerned. The 2 figures walked slowly towards one of the walls that was surrounding this field. Then it acted in a very unusual way. One of the humanoids began banging on one of the walls. He did this several times and then walked back to the center of this field, and one of the figures then pulled out a long, thin instrument from a sack that was strapped to his side and pointed it at the wall. At this point, a long, thin beam of light came out of the instrument and struck the wall. After doing this a few times, firing its little laser at the wall, both figures just turned around and walked back into their craft. Now at this point, the boys realized they were seeing something very unusual and ran back home to tell their families. So they didn't see the object actually depart. And as far as I know, there's no other information about this case, but it's certainly interesting because I can't help wondering why the ETs were shooting their light beams at the wall. Testing it? I mean, who knows? But it's a weird case. There you go. ETs coming out of their craft, whipping out their little laser guns and going pew, pew, pew at the wall. Who knows what's going on here? It's quite strange, but certainly interesting. And here's another case which actually got quite a bit of attention, generated quite a lot of controversy as well, actually. And I call this one ETs Like Toy Soldiers. This took place on December 31st, 1976 in Bignall, England. It involves 2 witnesses, and as we shall see, there's some other very interesting elements to it as well. At precisely 2:42 a.m., Nellie Richardson, age 65, says she was awakened from a sound sleep by a loud banging noise. Investigators did verify this because the neighbor heard it as well. So Nellie immediately noticed that her room was flooded with a brilliant glow, which she could immediately see was coming from a large, oval-shaped object hovering motionless in the sky at low altitude outside her window, which overlooked the Cheshire Plain and off in the distance the city of Crewe. So this object was either quite large or very close to her window, or both, because she said it filled a good quarter of her window, and she said it was actually larger than the apparent size of a full moon. And she watched it for quite some time until it eventually moved. She said it seemed to move towards her, at which point it turned a dark orange color, and after 40 minutes of watching this thing began to move away. And this is when she noticed humanoid figures silhouetted inside the object. They looked to her like, quote, toy soldiers. And she said they were moving to and fro, back and forth, inside this craft. She saw them for only a short while, and they disappeared as this object moved further away. So she's still watching it when suddenly her son John, age 31, came running into the house. He had been working the night shift at a restaurant, and he ran upstairs to tell his mother that there was a large orange sphere hovering over the Cheshire Plain. Of course, she was looking at it, and they both watched it move off into the distance. They also both noticed that their cat, who was never to be disturbed at night, was acting very unusually. She sat in front of the window staring at this object the whole time it was there. Now this case did end up getting quite a bit of attention. It was thoroughly investigated. Researchers contacted Manchester Airport and the Cheshire Police, neither who had any explanation or information. One of the researchers actually appeared on BBC television to discuss the case. And this is when the controversy began, because there were some researchers who, after looking into this case, wondered if perhaps Nellie and John had seen the moon and mistaken it for a UFO, because apparently the setting moon was near that location of the sky around that time. However, the witnesses denied this. They said that they saw it after the moon had set. They said the object had moved, that it changed colors, that it was oval-shaped and not round, and was actually larger than the full moon. And of course, there was the matter of the two humanoids seen, not to mention the weird behavior of the cat. Despite all these details, there are a few researchers to this case who really believe that these witnesses saw the moon. So what exactly the Richardsons saw, the moon or something else, it remains a mystery. So there you go. While some investigators are absolutely convinced those witnesses saw the setting moon, I don't know. I think it's pretty hard to mistake ETs for a setting moon. And let's face it, the investigators weren't there. This is a witness who at age 65 has seen the moon many, many, many times. So I don't know, hard to say for sure. Misperceptions do happen, but I think it's a valid case and certainly worth knowing about. And of all the cases I'm presenting today, this next one I find the most fascinating. It's really a quite complicated case involving almost the full range of evidence. So we have physiological effects, we have electromagnetic disturbances, we have landing traces and animal reactions, multiple witnesses apparently, and it's quite an extensive case involving a landed UFO and humanoids. I call this one E.T.'s Visit Transmitting Station. It occurred on October 18, 1977 at Hemledin, Sweden. This is actually a mountain which holds a transmitting station, and I think this is a very significant detail because this is perhaps what drew the ETs to it, as we shall see. This absolutely amazing case comes from researchers Carl Anton Mattsson and Thorvald Bertelsen, who you can see here, and it's an important case for many reasons. Primarily, I think, because it has so much evidence and because of where it took place. The primary witness is a gentleman by the name of Kurt Nilsson. He's a ham radio enthusiast. He had recently been having trouble reaching a friend on the ham radio in his car, and he was hoping to get better reception. So, around 6:30 p.m. on October 18, 1977, Kurt decided he was going to drive up the Hemliden mountain where this transmitter station was located. So he drove directly up to this station, which is located on Hemliden mountain, completely surrounded by forest. But strangely, after getting up there and parking next to the station, he still couldn't get good reception. While he could hear his friend off in another city, his friend couldn't hear him, and this didn't make much sense. So finally he kind of gave up, and it was around 8 p.m. when he was beginning to leave that Kurt saw something very strange. And as Kurt says in his own words, "My attention was caught by a pale blue object outlined against a hillock down in a hollow. I was casually studying it when I realized that it was some sort of machine with a dome. In front of the object there appeared 3 figures dressed in tight-fitting suits." So at this point he was about 300 feet away from the craft and the humanoids, which is pretty close. He said the craft was quite small, about 6 feet wide, and it looked like a classic flying saucer. It glowed brightly enough that the 3 figures in front of it were clearly visible. He said they were about 3 feet in height. They wore gray suits that had almost a plastic-like texture to them, and white boots and gloves that appeared to be attached without seams to the jumpsuits. They also wore helmets with sort of a faceplate in front. So he's absolutely amazed. He can see instantly this is not normal, and he flicked on the brights of his car headlights to get a better look at them. But the moment he did so, the craft and the humanoids seemed to just blink out. So he was shocked, and he remained in his car and waited for about 1 minute, when suddenly the craft and the humanoids reappeared. And this caused him quite a bit of fear, and he decided to drive off. And he got about 150 feet down the road, came around the corner, and now saw that the 3 figures he had initially seen standing in front of the craft were now standing in front of him, blocking the road. They were standing in the middle of the road. He stopped his car, he had no choice, and stared in amazement. Now his engine was still running, and his headlights were on. These 3 figures stood in a row in front of him, and the middle figure was facing him, holding this sort of weird curved shovel-like device. The other 2 were in profile. Both of them were kind of looking down at the ground or at this device, sort of towards the central figure. And at this point, the central figure took this shovel-like device, lifted it up with both hands, and aimed it directly at Kurt. Instantly, his car engine died, and the headlights went out. A terrible fear swept over him, and he actually thought to himself, "This is the end." So in a panic, he tried to restart the car engine, and to his immense relief, the engine did start. It roared to life. He put the car in reverse and quickly backed up about 30 feet. So he waited in fear for about 10 minutes, because at this point he couldn't see the ETs. It was dark. Finally, he turned on his headlights, and to his great relief, these figures were gone. Nor could he see the craft, though he does admit that where the craft had been, it was now behind a hillock, a small hill, and would have been not seen from the road. So he didn't care at this point. He wanted to get home. He rushed home and told his wife, Eva, what had happened. Now, as it turned out, years earlier, back in March of 1969, a gentleman by the name of Kjell Naslund worked at the transmitter station, this very station, and he had reported seeing humanoids in this exact same spot. In fact, his encounter received quite a bit of publicity. Kurt knew about it, and he called Kjell Naslund up. And of course, Kjell was amazed to hear Kurt's story and was even more amazed because he said on that night his TV transmission had been mysteriously disturbed. No more strange events were soon to follow. As Kurt says, describing about when he got home, he says, and I quote, "When I came into the kitchen, our dog began barking at me. I got bewildered because usually he greets me at the door and jumps on me with a leap of welcome. Then he lay down, pressed up in the kitchen corner." So somehow this dog recognized that something very unusual happened and apparently did not even recognize his owner. It's very odd. Kurt also noticed that his watch was now 20 minutes slow. And 2 days later, Kurt returned to the site with his wife and dog to see if the ETs and the craft might still be there. Of course they weren't, but he did notice something else weird. As Kurt says in his own words, "The dog reacted in a strange manner when we went up the mountain. He just followed me in the same footprints. Usually he runs in front of me and runs about everywhere." So Kurt's encounter did get quite a bit of attention, and it was shortly after it occurred that researcher Reinhold Karlby visited the site, and he found some interesting physical evidence. A birch tree where the object had hovered showed damage on the trunk, not at the bottom but sort of up off the ground a little bit, indicating that the craft had not actually landed, which was exactly what Kurt had reported. He also noticed that there were two heaps of moss that didn't look like they should be there. It appeared as if the ETs or someone had scraped them off a tree and deposited them at the site. So there's some speculation that the ETs were gathering vegetation. Also, found alongside both sides of the road where Kurt said he had seen the humanoids were tiny bipedal footprints. They were short and wide and round with sort of a strange cross on the heel, as you can see here. One of the most amazing things about this encounter, besides of course the electromagnetic disturbances, the animal reactions, and the apparent landing traces, was its location at the transmitting station, and of course the fact that another encounter had occurred at that exact spot 8 years earlier. It was on March 12, 1969 that Kjell Naslund, who was the director of the transmitting station, was at the location because alarms kept going off, and he had gone there to investigate whether there was a possible overload of the transmitter. But as he read the instruments, he couldn't find anything wrong. But then he received this powerful, he thinks telepathic impulse to go outside. And looking outside, he saw, only about 45 feet away, a large cigar-shaped object about 15 to 20 feet long. It was very low. It made a very loud buzzing noise. And as he watched, an opening appeared, and inside he could see this sort of tube-like corridor. And coming down this corridor were about 10 very unusual looking entities. At this point, he was unable to move, and the entities filed into the station, kind of shot out of the tube. They were hovering. They appeared almost transparent, and they were box-like in shape. But he did have the impression that this was sort of a covering, a protective armor, and that the beings were actually humanoid. And there was another very strange effect. Kjell said that his vision changed, so that it didn't matter where he looked, he could see the whole station all at once. So this sounds like some sort of weird telepathic rapport with these beings. And it was very obvious that these beings were very interested in the station because 8 or 10 of them just started milling around examining all the equipment. And a few of them actually approached Kjell and began to speak with him. And as he says in his own words, I can't explain it any other way than a feeling. It was no voice inside my head. I could hear their voices clear and distinct, but as if from far away. Intimate voices reasoning with me about my flying, giving technical advice, discussing navigation problems. Voices that calmed me and gave me knowledge I never could have found from others. Kjell says he felt no fear, but instead felt as if these beings were his friends, long lost friends or something. And they stayed for a good period of time, at least 10 minutes, he estimates, and then without warning, quickly went outside of the station and were sucked into the craft through this strange tube-like corridor. The little opening closed, and this craft immediately took off and was gone. The only physical evidence he found of the encounter was the top of a pine tree was sheared off, but it was a good amount of it, 3 inches thick. And in corroboration of Kjell's encounter, a local man did call the newspaper to say that he saw a strange craft on that same evening in that area. What an amazing case that is to have so much evidence of different kinds and for the same exact location to be visited twice. That's really, really unusual. And I think it's pretty clear that the actual draw of the ETs was the transmitting station. We know from so many other accounts that ETs are drawn to anything that's technological, whether it's a dam or an airport or a hydroelectric station or prisons even, anything technological, air bases, military bases, nuclear stations. So perhaps that's what they were doing there, investigating this station, which certainly seems to be undeniable in the second encounter. So, truly an amazing case. And now we get to another one, which I call The Babysitter and the Alien. This case took place on February 14, 1981, in a dense suburb in Greenburgh, Pennsylvania. And as the title implies, involves someone who was babysitting a young child and had this incredible encounter with a UFO and humanoid. It's a good case, it was well investigated, and although it is a single witness case and the person is anonymous, it has some important and unique elements to it. So again, this is a single witness case involving an anonymous teenager, but was reported to the police and was thoroughly investigated and has some very interesting aspects to it. 17-year-old Julie, that is a pseudonym, she was babysitting a neighbor's son in a crowded suburb in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Now she was married and she knew that her husband would be leaving for work around 1:45 a.m. So at that time she walked out onto the enclosed front porch of this home and was hoping to see him. But instead she saw something else. She saw a dark metallic triangular object with 3 lights on each end hovering just above the nearby homes. And as she watched, it apparently noticed her because it tilted down towards her, kind of showing its top side. And she could see that it had a bubble-like formation on top, and she could see what appeared to be 3 transparent windows. One was in front and quite visible, but the other 2 were on either side of this sort of triangular-shaped object. And as she watched, this object emitted a weak white light, very much, she says, like a flashlight beam, but it slowly descended downward, not hitting the ground all at once, but slowly, and illuminated the ground below it. And looking through the front window of the craft, she could now see 2 humanoid figures. And boy did they look strange. As you can see from her drawing, she said that they had, quote, very large heads, oriental-like eyes, gill-like ears, and two holes instead of a nose. While she could only see one of these figures from the shoulders up, she saw that the other one had a long, thin neck, broad shoulders, smooth white skin, and normal-looking arms. One was sitting down, but she could see that the other was standing behind an instrument panel, which she could see clearly. She drew it. She said it was white with two rows of small black knobs side by side on one side, with two gray-black circular knobs on the other side, and three sort of slide controls in the center. She said the interior of the craft was all lit up, though she saw no actual source of illumination. But she says she felt compelled to stand on the porch and watch this craft and humanoid, which she did for about 15 minutes before finally she was able to pull herself away and flee to the living room. And she sat there quite nervous, afraid, and anxious. And at this point the TV was emitting a weird buzzing noise and it went black. And also the light in the living room went out by itself. This was the only light that was on. So now she was thoroughly frightened. She ran to the phone and called her parents and told them to come pick her up and the young boy that she was babysitting too. Her father arrived, but by then the UFO was gone. The homeowners arrived shortly later, and they found no actual physical evidence of this encounter except for, of course, the burned out light bulb in the living room. So Julie was quite traumatized. She ended up calling the police, who referred her to the Pennsylvania Center for UFO Research. And the investigation showed that she was apparently telling the truth. The only thing was she had some confusion about how much time elapsed during and after the incident. I can only imagine what it was like for that poor girl to see this UFO so close up, so close that she could see this ET staring right back at her, so close that she could see the inside of the craft complete with control panels, and quite a lengthy sighting as well. It's entirely possible she was taken on board, given the confusion about time, though again there's no direct evidence of it. It was a very thoroughly researched case, and that alone makes it important. It's an important contribution to our understanding of extraterrestrial visitations. And now, moving along to our last and final case in this little collection, I call this one Russian Robotic ETs. This is a really remarkable case, which involves quite a few witnesses, some pretty interesting effects as well. It occurred on July 6, 1989, in a town called Khabarovsk-Volodsky, Russia. Not a whole lot of cases are coming out of Russia, certainly that reach the United States, so I like that aspect about it. But it's such an unusual series of events and a really unusual ET that the witnesses saw. It was around 2:30 p.m., again on July 6, 1989, and a group of 6 children were returning from just having visited a nearby river. And among these children were Sasha Krasavin, Olga Krylova, Sergei Belyavsky, Luda Rybakova, Svita Karatina, and Marina Sharayeva. Now, they walked along the street when they noticed what they looked like a kite in the sky. I mean, it was a kite. And they ran to go get a better look at it, and this is when they all noticed this sort of yellowish orange glowing sphere alongside the kite. One of them noticed it first and pointed it out to the others. But very quickly, this light became much brighter. It seemed to approach, and then to their amazement, it descended downward and landed on the ground, as you can see here at point B in this photo. It then scooted to the left at point A, and here is where it stopped. At this point, it still appeared to be a round glowing sphere, but almost instantly, This sphere separated into two serrated sections, almost like an egg cracking. And you can see illustrations of this by both Sergei and Sveta. The two sides of the objects were pulsating with light, and coming out from between the two pieces was a very large, tall, human-like figure. They could all see that it was taller than a normal person. They said it was about as tall as a bus, but very thin, with very long arms that came down past the knees. It was all gray in color except for the boots, which were black, and in the middle of its chest there was a bright, pulsating, yellow, luminous disc. The figure did not appear to have a normal head, just sort of a little dome. It walked stiffly without bending the knees, and it really reminded them sort of a robot. And as it started moving, the craft itself disappeared. And as this thing is walking along the field, the children saw another craft floating down in the sky and coming in for a landing in the same place where the first craft had been. Meanwhile, this robotic figure turned left and twice and finally walked over to a nearby structure, and it disappeared right next to this sort of telephone transformer. At this point, the children noticed a woman dressed in red who came running out of the bushes about 150 feet away from where the ET had just been. And she was actually moving towards where it had disappeared. And they shouted out, "Don't go! There is an alien over there!" The woman didn't hear them or was too far away to hear them, and she continued walking to where this robotic figure had vanished. And seconds later, she reappeared about 600 feet to the left. So she had disappeared and then reappeared where this UFO landed and had disappeared. And now she was running away wildly to the left. So this is all very unusual. And meanwhile, this second craft had landed, split apart exactly as the first one had, and out came a second identical robotic-looking figure, which behaved in exactly the same way the first one had. And as it was moving along, another ship came down and gave a repeat performance. And the second ET was still walking when this third craft landed. And the second ET disappeared. This third ET came out and was walking by as a fourth craft landed, and again, like the others, split apart, only this time no figure came out. So at this point, the children have seen 3 different ETs. At this point, all of them vanished, including the fourth craft. And after watching for some time longer to see if anything else would happen, it didn't, so the children went home. But Sergei, the oldest of the group at age 11, I'll just quote him. He said, "We saw a dot in the sky. It grew and grew very quickly. It then went down near the village of Konentsevo and rolled around. It rolled down the hill. It stopped at those bushes over there, and out came a man without a head. He had a glowing disc on his chest. His hands were much lower than his knees. He got out and went over to that iron thing that's standing over there." Again, a telephone transformer. "And he was still standing there and looking around as if he was getting acquainted with the surroundings." So it wasn't long before investigators heard about the case, interviewed all the children, and in fact, Sergei was actually placed under hypnosis to try to extract more details. And under hypnosis, he did describe these robotic figures in more detail. As he said, they are very high. They have a head with 3 antennae on top of the head with tiny silver balls on the end of the antennas. The coverall is gray. Boot-like attire is black, but without a heel. They are 3-digited, meaning they have 3 fingers. And as Sergei says, the mouth looks like a triangle with the point on top. There were 2 small black immobile points, or eyes. So these children were all interviewed by television reporters as well, and they went on TV and described what they saw. Also, they were, of course, investigated by researchers who were able to locate the woman in red that the boys had seen. But she had no memory of seeing any UFOs or beings at that time. She didn't remember anything at all about what the children described. But she did say that later on that same night, she and her family had seen a UFO hovering over their home just for a few moments before it flew off. So, hearing what the children had described, she did agree to be hypnotized. But as the hypnotist brought her closer in time to when the incident occurred, the woman would get a terrible pain in the back of her head. It was clear there was some kind of memory block, and they were never able to get any further information about her. But further queries revealed that the people around the village had been seeing UFOs landing in this area, particularly near the springs and high tension wires. And it was only 2 months later when another very similar incident in Voronezh, Russia would garner international headlines. But the two cases are extraordinarily similar. What an amazing and complex case. I suspect that these kids may have actually witnessed this woman in red being returned from an onboard experience. I think it's entirely possible. It's unfortunate that the woman herself wasn't able to recall any real detail about what happened, doesn't even remember the whole incident that the kids themselves saw. So that just raises levels and levels of mystery to this. A lot of questions surrounding that encounter, but super interesting because it preceded the really famous Voronezh encounter, which got so much publicity and is so darn similar to what these kids saw. It's an absolutely fascinating case. And that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode where we explored all these different humanoid encounters. So many different types of humanoids. That is so fascinating to me. It raises questions not only about who these guys are, these visitors to our planet, but who we are and the fact that we are all humanoids. It also teaches us a lot, I think, about ourselves and our reaction to being visited. There's still a lot to learn about this phenomena, which is why I love doing this research. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed this episode and maybe learned something. Either way, I truly thank you for watching. It's much appreciated. And until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking those questions, and most important of all, keep having fun. Bye now.